Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, What is Federated Single Sign-On? In a minute, the webinar will start recording. So it's just to say a quick hello, and then we'll move on and start the webinar properly. Hello, everyone. My name's Jane Charlton, and I work at OpenAthens with Christos, who's our presenter for the day. So welcome to our webinar, What is Federated Single Sign-On? This is a first of a series of our Back to Basics webinars, and there will be more webinars following during the year. But before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things that we need to run through. So first of all, the webinar is being recorded. If you have any questions, if you can please post them in the Q&A. If you have any general queries, please post them in the chat. And you can use the live transcript by just toggling it on and off during the webinar. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Christos, who is going to tell us all a little bit more about what is federated single sign-on.
Thank you, Jane. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I hope you can hear me okay. Here is what I would like to cover today. For the people that don't know me, my name is Christos Koutas, and I have been working for OpenAthens for a few years now. I would like to start the presentation with the main ways users have been accessing e-resources the last few years. Then I will dive into what federated single sign-on is, how it came about, why it is important, and what benefits it brings to libraries, publishers, and users. And at the end, we will have some time for questions and further discussion. Now, let's start with what technologies users have been using to access content the last few years. Now, when we say users, what we mean students, we mean researchers, we mean professors, anybody really who needs access to subscribed content online. And what we mean by subscribed content is anything from electronic journals, databases, ebooks, etc. Now, IP recognition is the most widely used technology, and it goes back to the 70s, as we can see here. Then in the 90s, we had some other technologies like VPNs, Athens, as we were called back then, and Easy Proxy. And in 2002, a protocol called SAML, which stands for Security Assertion Markup Language, was introduced. And most recently, you got other protocols like OpenID Connect, things like that. Now, IP recognition is an access method that was developed in the early 90s, when almost all computers back then were located in the library. Back then, we didn't have any smartphones, and very few people worked or studied remotely. And IP addresses back then were static. Now, when the technology advanced and mobile devices like laptops, tablets, mobile phones came about, access outside the campus wasn't available. And that's when proxy services came in to solve that problem. So what IP proxy services do is that they allow end users to appear to a publisher or content provider as if they were within the physical IP range of the subscribing institution, despite the fact that they were off campus. So many IP addresses are dynamic and constantly changing over time. The increased use of laptops and smartphones and tablets made the IP recognition model unable to accommodate these remote users. So to solve this problem, institutions started using proxy services and VPNs. And proxy servers and VPNs basically aggregate the individual user sessions behind a single institutional IP address. And since this address is within the range registered with the publisher, the aggregated connections are accepted. Now, on top of the technological changes that happened the last 25 years, we had COVID that accelerated this trend and highlighted the need for reliable systems to allow an increased number of remote users to access library resources. And during the last 3 years, offering uninterrupted and secure access to e-resources to users based anywhere has become paramount. Now, authentication and authorization. Authentication is when somebody asks the question, tell me who you are. You need to prove your affiliation with the organization. Then the publisher will make an authorization decision based on the information that is sent from the institution to the publisher. Authorization answers the question, what you can access. Now, the IP recognition model is constructed on the assumption that an IP address reliably indicates a user physical location. And that was true back in the 90s, but it isn't true now. The model assumes a physical location can be relied on to identify a legitimate authorized user. That means that the model conflates IP addresses with location and identity. This is the reason I refer to this model as IP recognition and not IP authentication, because the system works by recognizing an IP address, not by authenticating an individual user. Now, regarding user experience, IP recognition requires services like proxy servers or VPNs, which require remote users to log into a library portal first, then navigate to online content. And that's not a very good experience since users cannot access content directly on publishers' websites. In regards to maintenance, IP recognition is not easy to maintain. So if the subscribing institution's IP addresses registers change, these changes must be coordinated with potentially hundreds of publishers. Now, personally, I experienced that problem firsthand when I was working for publishers before joining OpenAthens. So there were a few times that libraries contact me directly to update their IP addresses urgently because their students didn't have access due to outdated IP addresses the publisher had in their system. Another thing that we are hearing from libraries is that it is very time consuming to manage these proxy servers. This doesn't allow librarians to spend time for more important things, such as helping the users discover the content and access that digital content the library subscribed to. And in terms of security, IP recognition is highly insecure. IP addresses can be easily spoofed and the institutional networks can be penetrated for illicit downloading. Since IP recognition has no facility for authenticating and authorizing users, it's highly vulnerable for misuse. Now, we also saw that hacking attempts were increased during COVID the last 3 years, since hackers targeted research institutions on a global scale. Research by one of the biggest publishers found out that more than 90% of compromise is through proxy services. So when users find it difficult or complicated to access content, what they do is that they go to a place like places like Sci-Hub. And for anyone who doesn't know what Sci-Hub is, that's an illegal website that gets users to share institution login credentials for access to scholarly research platforms. So they steal and openly share these login credentials on the dark web. And COVID-19 has accelerated the need for increased remote access and therefore increasing the security risk. Now, as we saw on the timeline slide earlier, there is a protocol called SAML that was designed specifically for authentication and solves some of the problems IP recognition causes. But before we talk about SAML and federated authentication and how it works, I would like to clarify what we mean by single sign-on. Now, without a single sign-on system, users need multiple username and passwords to access e-journals, e-databases, and e-books, and other library systems. That's not ideal, especially when you have an online environment where users' attention nowadays is very short. So single sign-on solves that problem and offers a much better experience. With one username and password, users can access multiple resources, as you can see in the diagram above. Now, as we saw previously, SAML started back in 2002, and it was designed specifically for authentication. So SAML certifies users' identity. And SAML is a standard that is used to exchange information, and that's what we call attributes in SAML terminology, about users with the resources they are accessing while keeping their login details private. SAML is well established and widely deployed and uses industry standards and best practice to digitally sign and encrypt messages to prevent fraudulent use or interception by attackers. Also, most SAML-based systems allow granular control over what attributes are exchanged with particular resources. When I say resources, I mean the publishers, the content providers. That makes SAML not only a more secure alternative to IP recognition, but also a more flexible framework for single sign-on for many different scenarios. Now, the concept of federated identity management was invented in the research and academic community more than 20 years ago. And alongside the technology, a model for building a fabric of trust has been established based around the idea of identity management federation. So to join a federation, which are typically organized geographically, identity provider and service providers must agree to set a practice of policies. So you have an institution on one side and a content provider, a publisher on the other side. Now, federations play an important role in ensuring that standards are being met by identity providers or service providers alike, and that we can trust each other. So federated access is the concept where registered publishers or service providers and institutions put their metadata in the same place. This way, publishers and institutions do not need to establish lots of one-to-one connections that they have to maintain. We talked about SAML being the international standard for authentication, but why do we need federations in the first place? Can't we just, use SAML and work like that? Now, there are a few problems with this approach because SAML is not a plug-and-play technology. So what do we mean is that if you could task 5 developers, for example, to build a set of SAML tools, and they would not all operate the same way. So federations then were created so that everybody involved adheres to the same policy framework, same technical infrastructure and standards. So the key thing about SAML in a federated environment is the deploy once, reused multiple times model. It's fully scalable. So an institution can connect to any publisher that is a member of its federation, and a publisher can deploy it once and connect to any participating institution within that same federation. So we noticed that demand from libraries around the world for a secure and modern single sign-on system has increased substantially the last few years. And federated authentication came to the front since it meets lots of libraries and publishers' criteria. So let's have a look at the specific benefits of a federated single sign-on system. And I would like to start with how the user experience looks like. So federated single sign-on offers a more seamless access experience, especially for remote users. The things have changed, especially the last few years, and access to library resources from anywhere and on any device has become imperative. Also, products and services such as Google, Netflix, the Amazon of the world, the Facebook, have redefined users' expectations. And now research shows that users nowadays start their journey on Google or Google Scholar rather than on the library's portal. And that creates all sorts of problems, especially if libraries rely on IP recognition. But with federated single sign-on, users are able to start their search on Google or Google Scholar and access the content they're looking for with just a few clicks. So the screenshot here shows that particular scenario. You can see that the user looks for an article on Google Scholar. When they find that article, they click on the link that can take them to the publisher's website. And then on the publisher's website, they can access that article via the institutional login button, as we can see. It's a very easy process and one that users are familiar with, since resembles similar patterns when users try to access other services on the internet. Now, with IP recognition, the user has to start their journey on the library's portal, which is not ideal, since we saw previously that a substantial percentage of users start their research on Google or Google Scholar. And the increase of remote users due to the pandemic the last 3 years highlighted this functionality and the benefit that federated single sign-on brings to the end users. Now, moving on, I would like to discuss how federated single sign-on can benefit libraries. So talking to libraries from different parts of the world, we can see that they face particular challenges when they are looking into what single sign-on systems they need to have for their library. So offering their users the best experience when they access library e-resources is very important for them. Another challenge that librarians face is the maintenance of these IP addresses or proxy servers. So what we hear very often is that libraries have one person working full-time to manage these, proxy servers. I was in India back in September, and I remember a university librarian was telling me that because their IT department changed their IP addresses, she had to contact all the publishers they subscribed to. And she said that was very time-consuming, not a good use of her time. Now, in terms of efficiencies and cost, SAML is a more stable technology and the most modern authentication system available. Now, the ongoing maintenance required is low, while a proxy system requires regular ongoing maintenance as resources change and proxy configurations need updating. And now some people might say, that's okay, but why can't we use just one-to-one SAML connections? Why do we need that federated workflow? So I included a diagram here to show how it looks like when institutions use one-to-one connection. So the problem with this connection is that they require more technical involvement to set up and maintain. And libraries that are not too technical, or we have some libraries, they tell us that they lack the resources, the manpower, they need the support of their IT team to set up and maintain these direct SAML connections. But the concept of federated authentication reduces that need for these one-to-one connections. So in practical terms, what happens, for example, when we have the OpenAthens Federation is that we manage all the connections in the federation. So if something needs to be updated, for example, a security certificate from a publisher, then we are able to work with a publisher to have that work completed with a minimal amount of impact. And a single change is made centrally, and all federation members benefit, rather than each library managing their own connections and fixing things independently. Now, regarding security, IP addresses are easier to spoof, while SAML provides a strong set of security tools and policies. And with SAML, unauthorized activity also is identified early, and the user account is blocked. Also, access for other users is not impacted, in contrast with IP recognition, in which publishers block the IPs and users, and an entire organization could be without access for hours or even days, weeks. We had examples of universities that had incidents every week when they were using a proxy service. And that was one of the reasons that they moved to OpenAthens. Federated authentication also preserves user privacy by using a persistent opaque identifiers, which can only be decoded by the subscribing institutions. Now, we talked about how a federated single sign-on system can help users and libraries. But what about publishers? Now, publishers have been adopting federated authentication the last few years for a few reasons. Firstly, publishers want users to be able to get to their content from anywhere on any device seamlessly. Now, another thing publishers like about federated authentication is that it's more secure than IP and more suited to protect their content. And now, again, you may ask, that's okay, but why publishers don't use SAML one-to-one connections, or what we call bilateral connections? And the reason is that one-to-one connections lead to higher overheads. They require more technical involvement to set up and maintain, as we mentioned previously. Publishers need to liaise with the library and IT team with every library that needs a one-to-one SAML connection. And this task is very technical and very time-consuming. Any changes to certificates or metadata can disrupt services for library customers. And any disruption to service could also result in poor relationship with the library customers and their patrons. And I would like to finish today with some key takeaways from today's talk. Firstly, federated authentication seems to be the way forward, and it looks like it will be with us for the next few years. Publishers and libraries all around the world are moving away from IP recognition, and the pandemic has accelerated this trend the last 3 years. And federated single sign-on is based on a robust, reliable infrastructure that improves the user experience, but within a highly secure environment. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think we have some time for questions, if I'm not wrong. Jane, do we have any questions at the moment?
Yes, Christos. So the first question is, where does OpenAthens come into this whole ecosystem?
That's a very good question. I'm trying to think the short answer and the long answer. The short answer is that we try to make OpenAthens the best service and product, regardless of the technology that we use. A few years back, when we were faced with the dilemma, should we go with federated authentication or IP recognition? And of course, our preferred method is federated authentication. That's the most modern approach. This is more secure, better for user experience, all the things that I mentioned above. But we are also realistic, and we looked globally at what libraries need, what patrons need, end users, and what publishers. And because publishing and the library space is a very fragmented industry, you have lots of libraries and publishers moving at different pace. And some of them are using federated authentication. They support that technology. Some other organizations support IP. So we wanted to approach this as a product and a service that can cater to everybody. So because we have the question that I've been asked many times is how many publishers you can connect to. So we wanted to answer this question by saying we can connect to 95% of the publishers out there, whoever uses IP and whoever uses federated authentication. So OpenAthens, in a nutshell, is a hybrid model that can support both technologies, so that libraries and publishers don't need to worry too much about the future, but also the present. I don't know if that made sense, Jane, but
yeah, it made sense to me. You talked a little bit about the history of IP and then SAML coming along in 2002. Where do you think the industry is headed?
Well, what we are seeing, and that's on a global basis, by talking to publishers and libraries, and by looking at what some other organizations like NISO are doing, the Seamless Access Initiative and things like that, we are seeing a move that going away from IP recognition towards the federated authentication. We had a few instances that publishers stopped supporting IP recognition. Most recent example, I think one of our partners told us that a library wanted to move to OpenAthens and federated authentication because some of their publishers stopped supporting IP. We heard the same thing in other parts of the world, in South Korea. And from all the initiatives in the industry, I'm seeing a general move away from IP towards federated authentication. The only question is how fast, and each country is moving at different pace, and even institutions, different institutions at the same country are moving at different paces.
Thank you, Christos. We had some questions when people registered, so I'll just go through and run through those now. So the next question is, what's the difference between federated single sign-on and normal single sign-on, and are they more secure than easy proxy? I think you may have covered some of that with the one-to-one connections and the one-to-many connections, but could you maybe add a bit to that question?
Yeah, of course. So single sign-on is that when you have lots of services from one organization, one domain, while federated single sign-on is when you have lots of apps, lots of services from different organizations. A good example is that if we think, for example, EBSCO, you're a library, you subscribe to EBSCO databases, discovery tools and everything. Now, an EBSCO SSO, a single sign-on, allows you as a user to go from one EBSCO product to another. But it doesn't allow you to go outside the EBSCO, for example, and go to Science Direct and log in, or to Wiley platform, or to any other publisher. Now, if you have something like a federated SSO, like OpenAthens, then you can go seamlessly between EBSCO and Science Direct and all the other publishers. Now, to the second part of the question about if it's more secure than easy proxy, generally speaking, federated authentication is more secure than proxy services. So I don't want to go into details about specific products, but that's generally speaking, that's the consensus.
Thank you, Christos. And someone has also asked, what's the best way to completely sign out of a single sign-on session? Do you need to clear your cookies?
I would say, and we have our consultant here that they can chip in, they can comment. I would say sign out, log out, and close the browser. That should do it.
You do automatically also log out after, I believe it's 8 hours of inactive use.
In our case, yes. When we're talking about an OpenAthens SSO session.
Thank you, Gary. Gary is from our technical support team and helping to answer questions today. Thank you, Gary. Another question, does federated single sign-on require an authentication point such as Microsoft Azure?
Well, if we are talking about OpenAthens, but if I understood the question correctly, no, because we can offer our managed directory, and we have also a library, a very customizable library portal as an authentication point. People can go there and log in. Oh, you are muted, Jane.
Sorry.
It happens.
So someone has said they love SAML, they use it, but they have a few questions around what you were saying about IP recognition and starting from a Google search. So I'll just read it out verbatim. So you said with IP recognition, the user has to start at the library website. They felt this statement was untrue. Often users start their search at Google or elsewhere, and due to IP recognition, they are able to access the articles, etc., from content providers seamlessly because their IP is recognized as being part of our institutional IP range. In this situation, the user is often unaware they are getting access due to IP recognition, and they have no interaction with the library website. Are you able to answer that question? It's quite a long question.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So is the question when they log in, when they are in the premises on campus, for example, and they try to go via Google and they go to publisher's website, then they log in automatically because it recognizes the IP.
I think I might be able to field this one. So yeah, you're quite right in saying that obviously if you're off campus and you try to access an IP-based publisher, then you wouldn't be able to get access in that way. But if you think of it like this, so if you're on campus, obviously you're within the campus's IP range and the publisher will allow you in. But if you're off campus, obviously you're not going to get access that way. What OpenAthens managed proxy allows you to do is to essentially use an OpenAthens link, which would then contain the IP or the proxy, and so that allows you to access that content from anywhere. So you wouldn't necessarily be able to directly go to like Google and just stumble across it if you're off campus, but it does give you the possibility or the option at least to use that dedicated URL to access it off campus.
Thank you, Gary. We're at 1:30, but hopefully if people have time, we can carry on answering your questions for a few more minutes, if that's okay. So one of the questions is, there are many convincing benefits. I'm just wondering if there are any downsides at all or potential risks relating to federated authentication in comparison to other options.
That's a good question. It depends on how you approach that and what you want to do, because there are way too many scenarios. We talk to libraries, and some libraries, they have the personnel, they have, for example, lots of manpower, and they can have many systems. So I was back in Greece a few months ago, and they used both federated authentication systems. They use Shibboleth and a local federation, a national federation. But for some other publishers, they were using VPN because they were using these publishers. They were supporting only IP recognition. So it depends where you are, your resources. Now, there's lots of things happening in the industry. We had a webinar about the changes, what's happening with the cookies with all the major players, Apple and Google and all the browsers the other day. So we were talking about potential risks and and how these changes would affect federated authentication, but I haven't seen another system, better, that covers pretty much the whole industry. So it's kind of, we are in this particular space that we have the legacy technology, that's the IP and the proxies, and then federated authentication coming on board. But we don't have anything else at the moment that can, be superior to federated authentication. That's how I see it. And that's, again, what we try to do with OpenAthens, is being agnostic pretty much, so that we can offer libraries one solution rather than using multiple systems. Libraries, when I talk to librarians, I ask them, why do you come, with us? There are plenty of options out there. One of the things that they say, is exactly that we don't want to use 2 or 3 systems, for example. We don't want to use shibboleth and have, people working on that server, and then we have the IT, or the library managing the proxy server and, everything. So the short answer to that question is that I don't see any other better solution at the moment in the industry.
Thank you, Christos. We have another question. There's lots of questions actually, which is great. How does federated single sign-on, how does it affect subscriptions as a whole? I don't know if this person is talking about subscriptions to OpenAthens or subscriptions to content, but I suspect it's subscriptions to content.
That's what I get. I'm not sure what we mean about how it affects.
I guess,
or if it's maybe how it's different with IP, or
maybe maybe the person who's asked the question can clarify a little bit more, but I imagine maybe it's to do with how can this support decisions around subscriptions, for example.
If that's the case, that's the question, then there are, with federated authentication, you can group users, you can restrict access to particular group of users, and that might affect subscriptions in a sense that it will give librarians a better tool to have better quality conversations with the publishers. I'll give you an example. When I was working, for example, for a publisher back in the day, and I was talking to libraries about subscriptions, they said, okay, Christos, I have 20, for example, users in the robotics department that they need access to that particular journal. Give me the price. And then what I was asking is that, okay, you said you need a subscription only for these 20 people. Did you have a tool to restrict access to this group of people, only to these 20 people? And if they say, well, no, we have IP, then we were giving them a price for the whole institutions because there wasn't anything to, restrict access. But whenever they had something like OpenAthens, they said, yeah, we can use what we call permission sets to restrict access to these 20 users. And then we were able, as a publisher, to give them a subscription, which cost much less because it was only for 20 people and not, 3,000 FTEs or, 20,000 FTEs. I hope that helped it. The question was about, subscriptions and how you can utilize federated SSO.
So one person has raised their hand to speak. So Emily, I'm going to give the opportunity to speak. So you need to unmute. There you go. You have the floor. Emily? Oh, I see. So you've switched off mute again. So sorry about that. We'll come back to the question. So there's a couple around privacy. So what kind and amount of metadata is sent by an institution in order to participate in the OpenAthens Federation? Christos, I don't know if you can answer that, or maybe Gary can answer it.
Yeah. So I believe we only send out 5 different attributes on a global level. So we have a way to basically give the library the access to send what they want to a publisher. So some publishers will just take the bare minimum which we send, which is the organization ID, role or scoped role, entitlement, targeted ID, and I believe unique ID. So that's sent globally to anyone that we try to access, but there may be publishers who also require additional attributes, and that's on a case by case. That's on a case by case basis, and we can add attributes to cover that.
Thank you. And another one around privacy. Privacy concerns are leading browser manufacturers to remove or disable features that support tracking of users. How do you think this will affect single sign-on? Now, I know that there's quite a bit of work that's being done by the W3C group on this, and also the Seamless Access group. And we are hoping to run a session on this at our Access Lab event on the 20th of March. So unless Christos and Gary are able to answer this question, I'd suggest coming along to Access Lab, or we can post a link to a Lianza webinar recording that took place in October that had some information around this.
Yeah, that's a big conversation that has
Yeah.
been happening the last few years. I mean, I think Google postponed the date that they were implementing the changes. But yeah, best thing is come to the webinar, come to Access Lab, because there will be people much better suited than me to explain the changes and how it may impact federated authentication.
Thank you, Christos. So yes, we will we'll send some details that we have already, and then if you want to register for Access Lab, we're hoping to run a session on that specific topic. Gosh, there's so many questions. I'll maybe answer two more questions, and then any questions that we have remaining we'll respond in an email. So one person has said, can we switch between publisher sites with one authentication session, for example, within one browser session?
What do we mean switching of publishers?
I think they mean, can they access different publisher sites within the one session?
Yeah. In my demos, probably some people have seen that, you can basically do exactly that. You go from one publisher's website to another. You're in a single session in one browser. There's no need to log in again or to use any other way of accessing the content.
Yeah. So hopefully that answers the question. As long as the organization is subscribed to that resource, then you should be able to, once you're signed in for 8 hours, and we'll be able to move seamlessly between different publisher sites. Can you address the comprehensiveness of OpenAthens as far as being able to use federated single sign-on to access all publisher platforms? How does OpenAthens address connecting to platforms that do not have the federated relationship with OpenAthens? Is an OpenAthens proxy used in these situations? I think we've already answered that question, haven't we? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, that's basically what we do, is that when an institution or a library subscribe to OpenAthens, in the implementation process, we ask them to send us a file with all the publishers that they connect to, all the privacy they have subscriptions. Then we go and talk to each publisher directly. And for the ones that they support federated authentication, we give them a piece of information on the entity ID and the scope to put it in their system. Now, for the other ones that they don't support federated authentication, but they support IP recognition, we give them an OpenAthens IP address. They put it in their system. So our proxy service works, similarly to Easy Proxy. The difference is that, it's everything on the cloud. The library doesn't have to manage that proxy service. We manage that internally. We have, people that manage these, the configuration file. So there's nothing to worry about. And there is another group of publishers that they don't support federated. If they don't belong to a federation, but they support SAML, they have some SAML capabilities. We connect with those publishers as well. And we do what I mentioned earlier, the one-to-one connections.
Thank you. I just want to ask this one more question. If you could just, we do have some information about this on our website, but what are the differences between OpenAthens and Shibboleth, the main key difference?
If my understanding is correct, well, Shibboleth is an open source service. OpenAthens is a managed service. That creates, that poses some differences in a sense that, you need to, everything that entails a managed service comparing to the open source. Then Shibboleth, you have to manage the Shibboleth server. We hear from libraries that they don't have technical expertise or the resources, that it's very difficult to manage this server. And then for the other publishers that they don't support, for example, Shibboleth or federated authentication, you still have to have a proxy service alongside. So it's like the two systems. That's what I mentioned when I brought the example about when I was in Greece, talked to universities that they had Shibboleth on one hand for like 10 publishers, and then they had IP, they have VPNs for the other 20 publishers that they subscribe to. So these mainly are the differences. And of course, with a system like OpenAthens, you get other add-ons like the reporting module. You have MyAthens Plus, which is our library portal, other services and products on top of the authentication service.
Thank you, Christos. And final question. This is for Gary. Is there an on-premise solution? If data is in the cloud, what country does the data reside in?
Yes, so there isn't an on-premise solution. It is just in the cloud at this point. So that's one of the differences, as Christos just mentioned, between like Shibboleth, which is hosted on site, and OpenAthens, which is cloud-based. Where the data is, I would have to double check on that one, because I think it's, I believe it's in the UK and the United States, but there could be another location. I'm not sure. So I would have to check on that one.
Thank you. And any remaining questions, we will come back to you on those via email. Christos, I just wondered if you could switch to the next slide. So yeah, just just a reminder about our event Access Lab, which is hugely popular with librarians all over the world. This year, we have decided to have it on 2 days instead of one. So the first day is on the 20th of March in the afternoon UK time, so that people from the Western Hemisphere can join sessions there. We have a keynote speaker, case studies. There'll be a panel debate around library user experience. So please do sign up for our Access Lab event. And as I said earlier, we're also hoping to cover off the impact of cookie privacy changes. So on the Thursday, the 23rd, we will be running Access Lab in the Eastern Hemisphere, so that librarians and publishers from Asia Pacific can join those sessions. So we do hope that you'll join us for Access Lab and indeed for future Back to Basics webinars. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much for attending and for all your questions. We will send out an email shortly with a feedback survey. Be ever so grateful if you could please complete it so that we can improve for future webinars and events. And within a week, we will be sending you a link to the recorded webinar available on our YouTube site. So I just want to say thanks everyone for attending. Thank you to Christos for presenting. Thank you to Gary for helping to answer the questions. And also thank you to my colleague, Michael, who's been helping to monitor the chat. So have a good day. Bye.
Bye, guys.